The workshop was a tomb of forgotten dreams, a mausoleum of ambition. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight filtering through the grimy window, illuminating the cluttered workbench and the towering clock that ticked with a haunting, backward rhythm. It was Silas's workshop, and it had become my obsession. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, I spent days poring over Silas's notes, deciphering his cryptic language. The clock, its hands moving in reverse, seemed to taunt me, its ticking a constant reminder of the unraveling time. The air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten dreams. One night, as I meticulously traced a diagram of a complex mechanism, my fingers brushed against a hidden compartment in the clock's base. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, lay a small, intricately engraved key. My heart quickened. It fit perfectly into a lock hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the workshop. The chamber beneath the floorboards was dark and dusty, the air thick with the musty scent of decay. In the center, on a rickety table, lay a dusty leather-bound journal. This one, unlike Silas's previous ramblings, was filled with precise instructions and detailed diagrams. It was a blueprint for a device, a time machine of sorts, designed to manipulate the flow of time itself. Silas's words painted a terrifying picture. He had discovered a terrifying truth: the clock, in its attempt to rewind time, was creating a paradox, a ripple effect that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality. The final entries were chilling. Silas had vanished, leaving behind a cryptic message. "The clock is not a key, but a warning. Stop it before it's too late." A wave of dread washed over me. The workshop's shadows seemed to writhe, and the clock's ticking grew louder, more urgent. I realized that Silas's warning was not a plea for help but a desperate attempt to stop me from following in his footsteps. The clock's hands continued their backward journey, and I knew I had to make a choice: follow in Silas's footsteps or heed his warning and stop the clock, even if it meant sacrificing my own curiosity and the secrets it held. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The clock ticked on, its hands moving inexorably backward, each tick a hammer blow to my sanity. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the air thick with the scent of fear and the echo of Silas's desperate warning. The workshop was no longer a tomb of forgotten dreams, but a precipice, a gateway to a reality I was not sure I wanted to see. The decision lingered, a cold weight pressing against my chest as the clock's relentless ticking echoed through the room. Silas's warning swirled in my mind, and yet the allure of discovery was like a silent whisper, coaxing me forward. I took a step toward the clock, its hands moving steadily backward, pulling me deeper into a past I couldn't yet see. With trembling fingers, I reached for the leather-bound journal, flipping through its delicate pages to Silas's final entries. They were written in hurried strokes, the ink blotched as if he had been unable to contain his urgency. Each word was filled with dread, yet laced with a temptation that I found hard to resist. The last page held a diagram, a winding set of gears, valves, and a device hidden somewhere in the depths of the clock itself. Silas had written just beneath it: "Once you see, you can never unsee." I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. This wasn't just curiosity, it was a calling, a path that had been set long before I'd even known this workshop existed. Armed with the instructions, I set about dismantling the clock, each piece revealing more of its mystery. Beneath layers of brass and steel, gears and springs, I found it, a small, glass-like chamber glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the backward ticking. As I held it in my hand, a strange warmth spread through my fingers, almost as if it were alive. In its depths, I glimpsed tiny fragments of images, shifting like scenes glimpsed through murky water. Before I could think, the room seemed to shift. Shadows elongated, flickering like flames caught in a sudden breeze. My surroundings grew dim as if the air itself had thickened. The glass chamber pulsed faster, each beat resonating in my chest. The images sharpened, scenes of Silas himself, deep in thought, working tirelessly in this very room. Then, as if struck by a sudden realization, he stumbled back, his face twisted in terror, as he scrawled his warning across the pages of his journal. I tried to let go of the chamber, but my hand wouldn't obey. Instead, the warmth grew unbearable, a searing heat that left my hand tingling. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, the workshop was both familiar and foreign. The dust was gone, the air alive with a strange hum. Tools were strewn about, half-formed devices abandoned in haste, and the clock, it stood in the center of the room, towering, its hands spinning wildly in a forward motion, then slowing, then stopping completely. "Who are you?" a voice demanded. I turned to see Silas himself, his eyes wild, his clothes disheveled, staring at me with a mixture of anger and confusion. I found your notes," I stammered, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I had to know what happened. You shouldn't be here." His voice was low, filled with a kind of sorrow I hadn't expected. "This clock isn't a machine for discovery. It's a prison, holding back something that no one should ever see." I watched as he crossed the room, reaching for the clock with a reverence that bordered on fear. He rested his hand on the dial, and the room seemed to shudder. "Silas, if this is true, why did you leave the journal, the clues?" I asked. He looked at me, a wry smile crossing his face. "Maybe I hoped someone would understand. Maybe I wanted someone to stop me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Or maybe I was as drawn to it as you are." With a final, anguished look, he turned the dial on the clock. The room twisted and darkened, shadows coiling around us, and the relentless backward ticking grew deafening. As the world collapsed, I knew then that Silas had seen too much, and now, so had I. I thought leaving Silas's workshop that night would be enough to silence the ticking, but the sound followed me, a soft, unrelenting beat. Every moment since my encounter with his ghostly presence felt like I was caught between two worlds, a constant reminder that my own reality was slipping away, inch by inch. I returned the next day, driven by a hunger that had grown overnight. The workshop looked unchanged, yet it felt different, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me. The journal lay open on the workbench where I had left it, and I saw, almost with relief, that I wasn't done here. Silas's diagrams, his hurried notes, hinted at the existence of a second mechanism, something that he had constructed but hidden away outside the workshop. The journal mentioned the source, though its details were frustratingly vague, wrapped in phrases like, "to shield the heart of the clock." I gathered supplies and, journal in hand, set off to follow Silas's final words. His notes led me through town and up a path into the hills overlooking the village, a place I had never ventured. Every step echoed with the ticking in my mind, louder, faster, as if it were drawing me onward. Hours passed as I followed cryptic instructions carved into stones and landmarks only someone as precise as Silas could have created. Finally, at the crest of the hill, I reached a small, ancient-looking shack, barely visible beneath layers of ivy and overgrowth. It was a structure hidden well enough that anyone could pass by without giving it a second glance, but I knew I had found what I was looking for. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, everything was cloaked in shadow, save for a faint glow coming from a small, crystalline device mounted on the far wall. It was no larger than my hand, yet it pulsed with an energy that sent chills down my spine. This, I realized, was the source Silas had written about. It was connected by thin, rusted wires to an old, heavy switch near the door. Scribbled hastily in chalk across the walls were calculations and warnings, repeated phrases like, "Containment is vital," and "Never sever the link." My fingers hovered over the switch, heart pounding as I debated what Silas might have been trying to accomplish with this mysterious device. Was it powering the clock, anchoring it in place, or something else entirely? Before I could think it through, my hand moved as if guided by something beyond me, and I flipped the switch. The glow flared, filling the room with an intense light that nearly blinded me. A low hum began, rising in pitch as the device crackled and shook, emitting bursts of strange symbols and numbers into the air, like projections of memory. For a split second, I glimpsed fragments of Silas's past, moments of him laboring over his notes, running his hand over the ticking clock, staring out into the distance with a look of both triumph and despair. Then, the glow dulled, settling back into its original, dim light. The images faded, leaving only silence and darkness. But something inside me had changed. I felt as though I had touched a thread in a larger web, something connecting me to Silas, the clock, and this device. A surge of understanding washed over me, illuminating what Silas had known but never written down. The clock was no ordinary machine. It was a vessel, a portal of sorts. It had the power to not just rewind time but manipulate it, splinter it into fragments, and pull people back to moments they were never meant to revisit. Silas had created the source as a safeguard, an anchor to prevent the clock from spiraling out of control and drawing in everything around it. As I processed this, a tremor shook the shack, and the faint ticking sound started up again, louder than ever, coming from within the walls. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, a shadow flickered at the corner of my vision. I turned to see a figure, barely there, a silhouette of Silas. He was watching me, his face an unreadable mask. "Stop," he murmured, his voice a strained whisper. "You cannot let it go any further." But I couldn't stop. Curiosity and dread fought within me, each urging me in opposite directions. I took a deep breath, knowing that if I didn't uncover the rest of the clock's secrets, the haunting ticking would never leave me. Silas's apparition faded, leaving only silence. The walk back to the workshop felt like a descent. I returned, not as a visitor but as someone bound to its secrets, destined to finish what Silas had started. With every tick of the clock, I felt the weight of time shifting, bending. And I knew that stopping was no longer an option. The clock's ticking followed me everywhere now. It was a haunting rhythm, echoing in my mind as I made my way through the workshop. Each tick felt like a whisper, a reminder of the power I had unleashed by tampering with Silas's devices. I knew the workshop held more secrets, and my fingers itched to uncover them. I returned to the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, pulling out Silas's journal. Flipping through its brittle pages, I discovered a passage I hadn't noticed before, notes about the link. According to Silas, the link was an intangible tether between the clock and the source I had found in the shack. It was what kept the paradox contained, preventing the clock's power from bleeding uncontrollably into the fabric of time. Without it, reality itself could become unstable. As I read, my hands began to tremble. The journal's margins were filled with frantic scribbles, warnings, sketches of strange symbols, and notes about the echoes of people who had been lost to the clock. I shivered as I recalled the apparition of Silas in the shack. Was he an echo too? A fragment of time trapped by his own creation? The room around me dimmed, and I felt a strange, cold sensation, as if the air had been sucked from my lungs. The ticking of the clock grew louder, more erratic. I stumbled to my feet and approached the clock. Its hands had slowed, shuddering as if struggling against an unseen force. The glass chamber inside it pulsed with light, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A sudden wave of dizziness hit me. I clutched the edge of the workbench, the world around me spinning. When the dizziness subsided, I realized something was wrong, very wrong. The room had changed. It was brighter, the tools on the walls arranged differently. It looked newer, untouched by time's decay. And then I heard it, voices. I turned to see a figure standing by the workbench, hunched over a set of blueprints. It was Silas, his face youthful, intense. He muttered to himself, his voice a low growl, frustration evident in his every movement. My breath caught in my throat. I was seeing Silas, not as a ghostly apparition, but as if I had stepped into the past. "Impossible," I whispered, but the scene before me continued, oblivious to my disbelief. Silas straightened up and glanced toward the clock, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed something was wrong. I held my breath, not daring to move. Then he spoke, his words directed at me, or perhaps at the clock. "Is someone there?" His voice was sharp, filled with a kind of desperate hope. "If you can hear me, you need to understand. The clock isn't just a machine, it's a trap. It feeds on time, on moments we shouldn't revisit. Every second you spend here, you're feeding it." I wanted to respond, to ask 1,000 questions, but my voice wouldn't come. I was frozen, trapped in a vision of the past, powerless to change anything. Silas returned to his work, scribbling on a piece of parchment. I watched as he wrote, the words forming a message I could barely make out. "To stop it, you must sever the link." Suddenly, the room darkened. The scene dissolved, and I was yanked back to the present, stumbling as the familiar decay of the workshop came back into focus. My heart raced, the echo of Silas's words ringing in my ears. "You must sever the link." I dropped to my knees, clutching Silas's journal as if it were a lifeline. I understood now why he had left the shack's device connected to the clock. The link was keeping the clock's power contained, preventing it from spiraling out of control. Severing it would mean cutting off its power source, but it would also unleash whatever paradoxes the clock had been holding back. My mind spun with the possibilities. If I severed the link, I might be able to stop the clock's backward pull on time, to stabilize reality. But it could also destroy everything, unraveling moments that should never have existed in the first place. And if I failed, I might end up trapped like Silas, an echo in time, forever lost in the fragments of a broken reality. I stood up, the decision weighing heavily on my shoulders. My fingers traced the edge of the clock's glass chamber. It felt warm, almost alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The ticking grew louder, almost deafening now, each second a reminder of the urgency of my choice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. If I was going to do this, I needed to be prepared. I needed to gather the right tools, to map out a plan. I couldn't afford any mistakes. The clock's power was unlike anything I had ever encountered, and one wrong move could shatter everything. But one thing was clear, I couldn't leave it as it was. Silas had tried to contain it, to warn others, but the clock had already ensnared me in its web. I was part of its story now, bound by the same threads of time that had claimed Silas. I closed the journal, my hands steady despite the fear coursing through me. I knew what I had to do. The ticking of the clock filled the room, a haunting metronome counting down the seconds until the moment of decision. And as I gathered my tools, I realized that the clock wasn't just a machine or a trap. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of my curiosity, my obsession. The only way to stop it was to confront those parts of myself, and sever the link before it was too late. The ticking of the clock echoed louder than ever, a metronome of impending doom as I prepared for what felt like an impossible task. The moonlight filtering through the grimy workshop windows seemed dimmer, as if time itself was being sapped away. I laid out my tools on the workbench, wire cutters, pliers, a small wrench. Ordinary objects that suddenly felt like weapons in a battle against the unknown. Silas's words from the past haunted me. "You must sever the link." But how? The link was an intangible tether, a bond between the clock and the source. It wasn't as simple as cutting a wire. If I was to sever it, I'd have to disrupt the energy flow, dismantle the very core of the machine that Silas had so meticulously constructed. I knew the risk. Severing the link could destabilize reality. Memories, moments, even entire threads of time could unravel. But leaving it intact meant a slow collapse, a constant drain that would eventually consume everything. I was at a crossroads, standing on the edge of a precipice where either choice led to the unknown. I took a deep breath and approached the clock. Its glass face pulsed with a warm, eerie glow, as if it were a living thing aware of what I was about to do. My fingers brushed against the intricate metalwork, feeling a slight hum, a vibration beneath the surface. I unscrewed the back panel and exposed the delicate, gleaming innards of the mechanism. Inside, the gears spun in reverse, defying logic, each one a miniature universe of intricate craftsmanship. At the center was a small crystal, faintly glowing, the physical representation of the link. It connected to the clock's main gears via a thin, shimmering wire, almost invisible. I traced it with my fingers, feeling the energy pulse through it. Severing it would stop the flow of power, but it would also unleash whatever temporal forces the clock had been containing. My hands trembled as I reached for the wire cutters. The choice felt insurmountable, but I knew I had to act before my resolve crumbled. I positioned the cutters around the wire, and as I squeezed the handles, a powerful shock surged through me. Images flashed before my eyes. Memories that weren't mine. I saw Silas standing before the clock, his hands shaking as he worked, muttering to himself. His face was gaunt, eyes haunted by a deep fear. Then the scene changed. I was standing in the middle of a grand city, filled with people, but they were frozen in place, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and confusion. Time had stopped, and the silence was suffocating. Suddenly, the vision shifted again, and I found myself in a vast, dark void, a cold wind whipping around me. The ticking was louder here, a cacophony of sound. In the distance, I saw it, the clock standing alone, its hands moving backward at a frantic pace. Shadows swirled around it, figures caught in a loop of time, reliving the same moments over and over. A voice called out to me, distorted and desperate. It was Silas. "You must choose. Free us, or become trapped like the others." The vision dissolved, and I was back in the workshop, gasping for air. The crystal in the clock pulsed violently, almost as if it were alive. It was now or never. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and snapped the wire. The clock exploded with a blinding flash of light. I was thrown back, crashing against the workbench. The room filled with a deafening roar, like the howling of 1,000 winds. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if time itself had turned against me. I struggled to my feet, shielding my eyes from the blinding light pouring from the clock. Its hands spun wildly now, forward and backward, caught in a violent dance. The ticking had become a chaotic clamor, an unearthly wail. I realized with horror that I had set something uncontrollable into motion. The workshop's walls began to warp and twist, the very fabric of reality bending under the strain. Shadows stretched and contracted, images of past moments flashing in and out of existence. I saw glimpses of myself, younger and older, standing in the workshop at different times. I saw Silas too, a twisted figure, his face filled with anguish and regret. In a desperate bid to stabilize the clock, I grabbed the wrench and swung it at the glowing crystal at its center. The crystal shattered with a sharp crack, and a shockwave of energy burst out, sending me sprawling once more. Silence fell. The clock stopped. Its hands lay still, pointing downward as if marking the final hour. The air in the workshop was eerily quiet, the oppressive ticking gone. I pushed myself up, my limbs aching, and approached the clock. The glow was gone, the crystal reduced to tiny, glittering fragments scattered across the floor. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over, that I had succeeded in severing the link and stopping the clock's unnatural pull on time. But as I stared into the glass face of the clock, I noticed something unsettling. My reflection wasn't my own. It was Silas. He looked at me with a sad smile, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting sorrow. "You've done it," he whispered. "But you've only stopped the beginning." Before I could respond, his image flickered and disappeared. The workshop around me felt different now, colder, more hollow. The clock lay still, a broken relic of an impossible ambition. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The silence wasn't relief. It was a void, an emptiness where the constant ticking should have been. As I stood there, alone in the workshop, I realized what Silas's final warning had meant. I had severed the link, but in doing so, I had set something else in motion. The clock had stopped, but time itself felt altered, different. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the world were holding its breath. I took a step back, suddenly unsure of everything. The clock, Silas's ghostly warning, the visions, I had thought I was putting an end to it, but perhaps I had only started a new cycle. A new story, one that would continue to unravel until someone else, driven by the same insatiable curiosity, found this workshop again. And in that moment I understood. The clock wasn't just a machine. It was a guardian, a gatekeeper, forever linked to those who tried to unravel its secrets. I had stopped it, but at what cost? Had I freed myself, or had I taken Silas's place in the clock's twisted game? The workshop was quiet now, but I knew that somewhere, deep within the fabric of time, the ticking would start again. The days following the severing of the link passed in a strange blur. The workshop was no longer the place it once was. It felt like a hollow shell, stripped of its strange, pulsing life. The clock stood silent, its glass face cracked, hands frozen at a time I couldn't decipher. The eerie quiet should have brought me relief, but instead, it filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I wandered through the dusty space, each creak of the floorboards making me jump. The strange energy I had once felt, like a living heartbeat in the room, was gone, replaced by an unsettling void. I kept expecting to see Silas's ghostly figure appear again, or for the clock to spring back to life, its ticking resuming with a vengeance. But there was nothing. Only silence. The fractured crystal lay scattered on the floor like tiny shards of ice. I knelt down, picking up one of the pieces. It felt cold and lifeless, a far cry from the vibrant, pulsating core it once was. Holding it in my hand, I tried to make sense of the events that had unfolded. I had severed the link, but what had I truly accomplished? My eyes drifted back to Silas's journal, which I had placed on the workbench. It lay open, the brittle pages fluttering in the faint breeze from the cracked window. I returned to it, skimming through the faded ink, hoping for some kind of closure, a final answer that would explain what had happened. Instead, I found something new. A section I had missed before, or perhaps one that hadn't existed until now. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible, as if Silas had scrawled it in his last moments. Echoes will linger. The unwinding has begun. The silence is a harbinger, not an end. Beware the reflections, they will seek you out. I froze, the words sending a chill down my spine. Reflections? I looked around the workshop, at the dim light reflecting off the broken glass of the clock. I could see my face, pale and gaunt, staring back at me. But as I focused, I realized something was wrong. My reflection wasn't matching my movements. I lifted my hand, but the reflection's hand stayed still. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the reflection began to move on its own, its expression shifting from blank to something more sinister, a slow, knowing smile. Suddenly, the room seemed to darken, as if a storm cloud had rolled in. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. The reflection of me took a step forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if it were trying to break through. "You think it's over?" my reflection said, its voice echoing around the room like a whisper carried by the wind. "You've only begun to unravel the threads." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the shards of crystal on the floor. The reflection's smile widened, eyes glinting with a malevolent light. It pressed harder against the glass, the surface warping, bending outward as if it were about to shatter. I felt a pull, a strange sensation like I was being drawn toward the clock. The room around me blurred, the edges of my vision darkening. It was as if time itself were collapsing inward, spiraling into the frozen hands of the clock. I fought against the pull, gripping the edge of the workbench, my knuckles white. "What are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the small space. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, calculating anger. "I am the echo of your choice," it said. "You severed the link, but you did not destroy the cycle. You only shifted it. And now, the echoes will find you." With a deafening crack, the glass of the clock shattered, sending shards flying across the room. I ducked, shielding my face as the pieces rained down. When I looked up, the reflection was gone, the surface of the clock empty, a void of darkness staring back at me. I staggered to my feet, my breathing ragged. The air in the workshop felt thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could sense all around me. It was as if the shadows themselves had come alive, whispering secrets of the past, murmuring about choices made and paths untaken. I knew then that severing the link had only unleashed a new kind of chaos. The clock's power hadn't been destroyed, it had been set free, spilling its strange influence into the fabric of time. And now, the echoes, fragments of moments from the past, future, and everything in between, were loose, converging on the source of the disruption, me. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, and I clutched my head as memories flooded in, memories that weren't mine. I saw glimpses of people, places, events I had never experienced but felt as if I had lived through them all. A woman standing on a cliff, her eyes filled with sorrow. A child laughing in a field of golden flowers. An old man weeping beside a river. Each image was vivid, intense, and gone in a heartbeat, replaced by another, then another. The workshop felt like it was spinning around me, the walls closing in. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the onslaught of memories. I pushed it open and staggered outside into the night. The air was cold and crisp, but the sky was wrong. The stars above were moving, shifting, forming patterns I didn't recognize. It was as if time itself were unmoored, the constellations rearranging like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head, trying to block out the noise, the whispers of countless voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. I had severed the link, but in doing so, I had shattered the barrier between time and reality. Now, the echoes of every moment the clock had ever touched were bleeding through, merging into a chaotic river that threatened to drown me. As I knelt there, the wind howling around me, I realized the truth. I was the new link. By severing the tether, I had become the focal point, the anchor holding the fragments of time together. And until I found a way to contain or destroy this power, the echoes would continue to hunt me, to merge with me, to make me a prisoner of their endless, cyclical madness. With a shuddering breath, I pushed myself to my feet. The night was still, the stars swirling in a chaotic dance. I looked back at the workshop, its dark silhouette looming against the twisted sky. The journey was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. I took a step forward, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had unleashed. The echoes followed me, a whispering chorus in the night, as I walked toward an uncertain future, determined to find a way to end this once and for all. The morning after the encounter with the reflection, I woke up on the workshop floor, my body aching from the cold and the tension of the previous night. A pale, wan light filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench. I had barely slept, haunted by fragments of memories that weren't mine, each one more vivid than the last. I pulled myself up, wincing as I did so. The shattered glass from the clock glittered like ice on the floor, and the journal lay open where I had left it, as if waiting for me. Silas's last cryptic warning echoed in my mind. "Beware the reflections, they will seek you out." I couldn't stay here. The workshop had become a nexus, a focal point for the strange echoes of time bleeding into reality. If I stayed, I'd be trapped in this whirlwind of disjointed moments forever. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small, intricately engraved key I had found before. It had unlocked the hidden compartment in the workshop, but I had a feeling its purpose wasn't finished yet. I ran my fingers over the metal, feeling its strange warmth. It was as if it held a pulse of its own, a beat that synced with the rhythm of my own heart. The only place left to search was Silas's old home, the one he had abandoned long before I had taken up residence in the workshop. I had avoided the place, wary of the ghosts that might linger there, but now I had no choice. Silas's home stood on the outskirts of the village, a solitary, decaying structure half consumed by creeping ivy and time itself. The windows were dark, staring back at me like empty eyes. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood groaning as if in protest. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old books and disuse. The entryway was lined with shelves filled with dusty tomes, their spines cracked and worn. A thick layer of dust coated everything, undisturbed for years. I stepped inside, feeling a chill creep up my spine. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. I made my way through the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The key in my hand seemed to vibrate, guiding me like a compass. It pulled me deeper into the house, toward a door at the end of the corridor. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The room beyond was a study, much like the workshop but more orderly. A large, mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface covered in papers and old maps. But what caught my eye was the massive mirror that stood against the far wall. It was tall and ornate, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't showing me the room as it was now. Instead, it showed the room in a different time, papers neatly stacked, a fire burning in the hearth. And there, seated at the desk, was Silas. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Silas looked up, his eyes meeting mine through the glass. He was younger than I had ever seen him, his face free of the worry lines I had come to know in his journal sketches. He studied me with a curious expression, as if he could see me too. "You found your way here," he said, his voice muffled, as if coming from a great distance. "I knew you would." My throat felt dry. "Silas? Is this real?" He gave a small, sad smile. "As real as any echo. This is a memory, a fragment of what was. When I realized what the clock could do, I left parts of myself behind, like breadcrumbs. You created the link," I said, my voice trembling. "You set all of this in motion." "I did," he admitted. "But not for the reasons you think. I wasn't trying to control time. I was trying to save it." "What do you mean?" Silas's image flickered, the room in the mirror dimming. "The clock was supposed to be a safeguard. A way to anchor time, to keep it from unraveling. But something went wrong. The Devourer, the entity feeding on the echoes, twisted its purpose." "The Devourer," I whispered, the name sending a shiver down my spine. "Yes. It's a force beyond comprehension, feeding on fractured time, on the broken moments left behind. By severing the link, you weakened its hold, but it's still out there. And now it's searching for a new anchor. It wants you." The room around me seemed to warp, the walls closing in. The key in my hand burned, the metal searing into my skin. I dropped it with a gasp, the clink of metal on wood echoing in the small space. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice desperate. Silas's image flickered again, fading in and out like a weak signal. "You have to destroy the heart of the clock, the Nexus. It's where all the fractured moments converge. It's the source of its power." "Where is it?" "The place between moments, where time stands still. You've felt it before, haven't you? That sense of being outside of time, lost in the echoes." I nodded, remembering the sensation from the workshop, the feeling of slipping into a space where time seemed to pause. "You must go there," Silas said, his voice growing fainter. "Find the Nexus and destroy it. It's the only way to end the Devourer's grip on reality." The image in the mirror began to dissolve, the room in the reflection returning to the dusty, abandoned state it was in now. "Wait!" I shouted, reaching out toward the glass. "How do I find it?" Silas's final words were barely a whisper. "The key will guide you, but the journey is yours alone." Then he was gone, the mirror reflecting only my own pale, frightened face. I left Silas's house, the key clutched tightly in my hand, its once warm metal now cold. The sky outside had taken on an eerie, twilight hue, as if the sun were struggling to rise. Time was distorting again, warping around me. I could feel the Devourer's presence, its hunger pressing against my mind. There was no time to lose. I needed to find the Nexus and put an end to this cycle. With one last look at the decaying house, I turned and made my way back to the workshop, the key guiding me like a lodestar. As I walked, the world around me shimmered and shifted. I passed through moments that were not my own, a wedding procession, a child's laughter, a fierce storm battering the landscape. Each scene flickered past like pages in a book, blending together into a chaotic stream. I knew I was on the right path. The echoes were converging, leading me to the Nexus. I gripped the key tightly, feeling its pulse synchronize with my heartbeat. I was close, so close. The air grew cold, and a thick mist rolled in, obscuring my vision. I pressed forward, feeling the pull of the Nexus like a magnet, drawing me in. The mist parted, revealing a clearing, and in the center stood the Nexus, a swirling vortex of light and shadow, a void where time itself seemed to fold in on itself. I stepped closer, the key glowing in my hand. The Devourer's presence was palpable, a dark, suffocating force that pressed down on me. I could see shapes moving within the vortex, faces, moments, fragments of time caught in the swirl. With a deep breath, I raised the key. The light intensified, and I could feel the fabric of time itself straining against me. I had to act quickly. With a final, determined thrust, I plunged the key into the heart of the Nexus. The world exploded into light, and I felt myself being pulled into the vortex, the echoes of 1,000 moments swirling around me. The Devourer's scream pierced the air, a sound of rage and despair as the Nexus began to collapse. I held on, the light blinding me, my body feeling as though it were being torn apart. But I did not let go. I had come this far. I would see it through. Then, suddenly, there was silence. The light faded, and I was left standing alone in the clearing, the Nexus gone. The air was still, the mist lifting to reveal a sky filled with the soft light of dawn. I had done it. The Devourer's grip was broken, and the echoes had finally found peace. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The clock's influence was gone, the cycle broken. I had faced the echoes and emerged whole. I turned back toward the village, the key now a simple, inert piece of metal in my hand. The journey was over, but its memory would linger forever. I walked away, the dawn light warming my face, knowing that the echoes had finally been laid to rest.